So I'm quite intrigued because in the last couple of months, I have sort of been inundated with requests by people saying, can you come and tell us what you think, how things are going? And some of the people who decided they did not want to hear include my friend Laila, who's, I'm joking. I hadn't seen you. I just wanted to say hello. So anyway, so many people who want to hear about this, and I take that to mean that there's probably some recognition and concern about the state of the economy and where things are headed. I have to weigh whether you want the raw version or you want the sugar-coated version. And because I did not know much of this audience, I didn't know what to do. So I sort of decided I'm going to stick to the middle of the road. So this is the middle of the road version. But of course, as we get to, probably we're going to ask questions. You're free. We have a kind of a disconnect between what you hear in terms of the narrative around the economic numbers, that the economy is growing. You've got a headline number which is telling you that we are growing at 5 to 6% over the last couple of years. That's quite robust economic growth by any standards. If you sustain that for several years, with our population growth rate about 2.2%, and you're growing at 5.5%, that's a 3% per year per capita income growth. If you do that for 15 years, that's East Asian tiger growth. 3 to 4% per capita income growth, sustained for 2 decades, is East Asia tiger growth from 1970 to about 1990. So since it seems like we've been doing that, or at least we are approaching, why aren't we seeing ourselves, why aren't we seeing the transformation? Why aren't you seeing the prosperity that those headline numbers suggest? So that's what we hear. We're doing all sorts of things. But on the other hand, you see, when you listen to business, there's quite a bit of distress. Business are saying they are in distress. We are now hearing increasingly, including government itself, acknowledging that it's in financial distress. They're even beginning to talk austerity. So if you're growing at 5 to 6%, businesses should not be in distress. What's growing? If businesses are in distress and government is in distress and people are being laid off, so consumers are also saying that they're not feeling that things that are ground mambo is different. So my sort of thing is to try and square that circle and what explains that and what it means. What does it portend? So you may need to fasten your seatbelts because part of what it tells is a bit turbulent. There's a bit of turbulence. And I'm just going to tell this in sort of a couple of pictures. The way I sort of say this, the economy is growing, businesses are struggling, government is in financial distress. What's going on? That's the question I'm going to try and address. That will tell you, especially this government is in financial distress, the big thing that we are going to be grappling with is this fiscal crisis. This is the big thing going on in the country. And that has, you may already be hearing this language of government talking about fiscal consolidation. So what is this beast and what does it mean to businesses and to people in the investment advisory space like yourself? I'm going to begin with something which may look like a contradiction. You know, I've got politics and I've got graphs. You know, what is this about? You know, one of the things that a couple of years ago, 5 years I think, I wrote a piece, an op-ed, where I said that if we keep doing what we are doing, we are going to be overtaken. And I said, in fact, Tanzania is going to overtake the size of our economy in a couple of years. And there was an outpouring of rage that shocked me. The idea that we could be overtaken by Tanzania was something that I did not expect that Kenyans would take such offense at. Yet it was a fact that it was actually going to happen. And then that's when I realized, I think we've been like living like frogs in a well on past glory, thinking that we are going to continue, we are the dominant economy in East Africa and the region, when we no longer are. And I think that's partly what is surprising people, because they are sort of got a bit of baggage. And so the story I was telling, which you can see here, I got to explain. This is the size of East African economies relative to Kenya. So, and this is what it was. We started 1990 when we started the political and economic reform sort of transition in this region. I've got 1990, I've got 2018. And I've got the countries here: Burundi, Rwanda, Uganda, Tanzania, Ethiopia. So this was the size of their economy relative to ours in 1990. And this is the size of their economies relative to ours today. So if you look at Ethiopia, its economy was 58% ours in 1990. Now it's 25% bigger. Tanzania was 68%, about 17. Now it's the same. 98% is the same size. And you can see everybody else, except Burundi, has closed the gap. If you look at the same in terms of income per capita, everybody has closed the gap, some degree. Tanzania has actually sort of closed it completely. Now, what is responsible for this? Why am I saying bad politics? If you take the Tanzania case and you compare, this is what has been happening to our economy since 1990 to date compared to Tanzania. This is Tanzania, this is Kenya. And if you look at Kenya, there is something you will recognize. Yeah? What are these? Elections. Yeah? So this election, we had one, Tanzania has only had one election shock after the transition to multi-party. But we've continued to have huge elections. So this is 92 election shock. Economy drops from 4 to 0 growth. Then you have this 97. You have a lot of uncertainty and all sorts of things going on. As Moi's last term, we go all the way to the bottom, recover very quickly. We think we've turned the corner. We come to 2007 and we get the big one. Then we think we overstill, we're still having those shocks. And of course, we are in the middle of another sort of political business cycle now. Tanzania, of course, recovered. If you look at this gap, Tanzania recovered and has managed to whatever and maintain, so that when you have Tanzanians elections, you don't hear an economic sort of connection. They have elections, they are non-events. And there are sort of quite a number of countries where elections are now non-events as far as the economy is concerned. Now, how much does that cost? If you take the non-shock years in this picture, in the non-shock years, we've grown by 5.6% on average. Tanzania by 5.9. So the difference is 0.3 of a percentage point, which is only 5%. But overall, the difference is we've grown by 3.8, Tanzania by 5.6. So the impact of the shocks is Tanzania has grown 40% faster. Why? Because although we have shock years, we've grown by 1.4. Tanzania is only 4 years. But for us, it's 13 years. So if you have 13 political shock years, when your economy sort of just deflates, over a period of 30 years, is that 30, almost 30 years, yeah? Almost 30 years, 13 years is 40% of the time. It's going to add up. And if you have a growth difference of 3.8, 5.6, almost 2 percentage points, if you compound that for a decade or two, it actually leads to a fairly significant divergence. So politics can be costly. So when people see me doing politics and they think it's for the sake of it, it is because I know that is where the problem lies. And unless we sort out particularly this problem of not being able to, you cannot, if we decide we are going to be a multi-party democracy, then we must be able to transfer power by means of an election. If we are not going to be able to accept that we can transfer power by means of an election, we need to change the political system so that we stop having elections. And we come up with another method of transferring power. Either you have a monarchy, so that you follow primogeniture, and that's very simple. You say, the son or the daughter shall inherit the throne. It removes the uncertainty. That's why they say, the king is dead, God save the king, because there is no vacuum. Or we find something else. But we cannot keep saying that election is the means of transferring power. But we cannot accept to hand over power when we lose elections. That is going to, if we continue doing that, this gap is going to grow, and I can assure you in 20 years we'll be the poorest country in Eastern Africa. That you can take to the bank. Now, that's bad economics. In addition to bad politics, we have also added bad economics. This is quite new. We haven't done bad economics before. And I'm going to start with a bit of a lesson. Now, this is a picture of the composition of growth. It's from an IMF report. The IMF does, I don't know, some of you may come across this IMF report, does twice annually, regional economic outlooks. And I think this is the one for April this year. And it breaks down growth into its components. The deep blue component is investment. The light blue is education and human capital. The green is labor force, and the brown is productivity. Now, the way this works is what you want. The reason why you want to invest in capital and skills is to make labor more productive. Okay? So what you want is to invest in human and physical capital so that you can raise productivity. Okay? Because it's productivity which pays the bills. So if you borrow money to invest in capital or to educate people, you expect that that economy will become more productive so that the productivity will pay the debt. Now, if you look what happened in Africa since 2000, when we were talking about Africa rising, most of our growth has come from investment, from capital accumulation. In economics, we say from factor accumulation, as opposed to, and of course, including labor. But labor you don't pay for because people are born. Labor you get free. You get free from nature. But so we call this factor accumulation, and we call this productivity. So it's all factor accumulation. If you look at recent years, in fact, productivity is sort of contracting, and it's all sort of slow growth, low factor accumulation. If you look at other developing countries, you've got a bigger proportion of productivity growth. So, if you are financing your capital accumulation by borrowing so that you can build mega infrastructure, and it is not raising productivity, you are going to get into debt distress. Just like business. Yeah? So, when you hear me making noise about mega infrastructure and productivity, this is what I'm trying to say. That if this capital is not productive, you're going to end up here. And then your economy doesn't have the capacity to pay. What you want is, if you're investing in capital, you want to see rising productivity. You want to see productivity contributing a bigger share of growth. Now, that's just a broad Africa picture. When we come home, this is from a recent government report called Public Expenditure Review. If you go to the Treasury website, you'll find it. It's called Public Expenditure Review 2017. And it's doing the same diagnostic, but now referring to our own economy. Over the last few years, it's trying to explain the phenomena we've been talking about. On the demand side, growth has been driven largely by an increase in private consumption and government expenditure, while the contribution from private investment has contracted. Private extent investment is essential for all sorts of things, And it points out that the contribution of growth from Kenya's private sector investment has been falling over the review period, contracting by 2.8% in 2016. Comparatively, in 2013, when the economy expanded by 5.9%, the private sector contributed 25% of the growth. And they talk about figure 3. Then they explains that the slowdown in private sector investment, especially in 16 and 17, could be attributed to wait-and-see attitude induced by uncertainties during the 2017 general elections. So now you have a convergence of bad economics and bad politics. Now, why is private sector investment contracting? And you can see that they talk about figure 1.3, so we can look at figure 1.3. Now I'll explain how figure 1.3 works. This is from the same report. What is done is similar to what we saw from the IMF report, but now it is the composition of our growth into 4 components. The same things: government consumption, private consumption, government investment, and private investment. And you see, from around 2012, it's a moving average. This is the growth rate, the diamond, averaging 5 to 6%. And this is the composition of that growth. So you say in 2012, and before 2012, you're looking at private investor contributing, economic growing at about 6%, private sector investment contributing that, private consumption, government is this. And as you're moving forward, you want to follow this. The private investment is shrinking, and you get to a point where the private sector investment goes under the water. And what takes its place is government. Yeah. So what is happening is that government has crowded out the private sector. First from the credit market, because it went out and borrowed all the money. And then because government is doing all the spending, it is also crowding the private sector from the factor market. Because if every government is building infrastructure, all the resources have gone into that sector. The engineers, the transport, yeah? All the private sector is now competing with government, which is able to pay higher prices and all manner of things. So all the sort of the government spending, the government public investment is now sucking in not just the money, but also other resources. Yeah. And that's why private investment contribution. Now, if private sector investment is not happening, because government is sort of crowding you out, government itself is explaining to you very clearly what will happen. It's telling you private sector investment is essential for replacement of capital stock, adoption of frontier technology, boosting farm productivity, and ultimately private sector-led growth. So what happens is that most of the private investment, that particularly financed by credit, as you know, goes actually to replacing your capital stock. Your machines are growing old, so you sort of scheduled replacement. If you're in the transport business, you get rid of old trucks, you buy new trucks. You change your computer systems. And typically, a new technology is embedded in that investment replacement. So that's how the economy raises its productivity, because technology is embedded in that kind of replacement of the capital stock. So if farms then decide to delay the replacement of that capital stock because their investors are uncertain about the future or because they have been crowded out of the market, it means that you're trying to get more output out of machines which are breaking down all the time because you keep postponing, and that's why your productivity is going down. Now, when that happens, the very government which has crowded out the private sector is expecting that same private sector to pay taxes. Yeah? And it's saying, oh, KRA is not meeting its targets. But the reason why KRA is not meeting its target is because the taxable economy, government is now almost half of the growth. So if here you are growing at 5%, government is contributing 20%, private sector is producing 80%. So government will be, one percentage point will be government, 4 percentage points will be private sector. By the time you get where we are now, which is 50-50, If you're growing at 5%, it's 2.5% government, 2.5 percentage points private. So what has happened in reality is that the private sector growth has come down from 4 to 2.5%. And that's the tax-paying economy. Because the government tax economy is not paying tax. Government cannot tax itself. And then it is giving these contracts to foreign Chinese companies, which are tax exempt anyway. So it's trying to chase its own tail. So then where that leads you is this kind of situation. Your tax revenue to GDP is falling. You see, it falls. This is financial year 13-14. It falls, and this is on this side of the scale. It's falling from about 17.5%, and it's fallen to about 15%. And if you extend it, it's now sort of heading towards 13.5%. So you've lost about 3.5 percentage points of GDP in revenue yield. Now that loss of revenue yield, if you calculate it in shillings, last financial year, it translates to about 300 billion shillings. So that's why you are budgeting. Government is forecasting revenue at 1.8 trillion, but it keeps collecting only 1.5 trillion. That's what you call a revenue yield gap. Now, your revenue yield gap is falling. This is the same thing, but this is falling because a lot of this money was borrowed. It's falling when your debt service is rising. So your debt service is now risen from 2% of, this is interest only. Your interest has risen from 2% of GDP to 4% of GDP. It's doubled. So you are collecting 17% of GDP and 2% of GDP was going to interest. So you had 15% of GDP to spend on other things. But now you are only collecting almost, this is another year, I've added another year here. You're now collecting 13.5%, but you are paying 4% of GDP in interest. So you now only have 9% of GDP to spend on other things. I mean that you're squeezing yourself. And if this continues, and this is going up, and this is going to go up because a lot of the loans you've borrowed are kicking in. There are some of them which you have to pay principal payments and stuff like that. And you're actually having to borrow. Like if you look at the budget this year, the government was budgeted to borrow 700 billion shillings. But revenue is, again, that was budgeted on the basis of 1.8 trillion shillings of revenue. But revenue is only projecting at 1.5 trillion. So the government has to decide whether it has to cut the budget by 300 billion or it has to go to the market and borrow another 300 billion, whether domestically or foreign. Now, if you probably is going to do a bit of both because it's very difficult to cut that much expenditure. So it means your borrowing goes up by probably another 100 billion or so than you had budgeted. So if you borrow 800 billion, next year's interest will go up. So you are on what we call in macroeconomics an explosive debt path. So unless you do something, sooner or later something is going to give. And so that's your fiscal problem. But it's not creating you just a problem on the fiscal side. It's also creating you a problem on the financial side, banking side. Because a lot of this has to do, all this borrowing, a lot of it is domestic. Half is domestic, half is foreign. And obviously the domestic one has implications on your financial sector. So you're able to see, because you've crowded out government, sort of private sector, this is the total profit of banks. The total profit of banks has actually fallen. It used to be, if you look at a couple of years ago, the banks made a total of 100 and how much is it? Yeah, almost 140 billion shillings. And they are now down. Last year, they made about 110 billion shillings. But if you look at how much where their money is coming from, in 2017, the bank's total bottom line was 104 billion. Interest on government securities was 102 billion. In 2018, interest on government securities is more than the total profit of the banks. So government is now the profit center for the banking system. And you know at the same time that bad debt portfolio has increased from about 5% and it's now headed towards 14, 15%. So if government then decides or needs by whatever reason has to reduce its borrowing, the fiscal consolidation, one of the things you're going to ask is what happens to the banks which are now dependent on interest on government securities to cover for the fact that they are not making income from private lending. So if, for example, because what happened is that when government started crowding out the private sector, interest rates started going up. When interest rates started going up, the politicians noticed this and they responded by capping interest rates. Once they capped interest rates, they then postponed the economic cost, the political cost for government. Because if government had continued to have such a high appetite for borrowing, it would have pushed interest rates probably to the 25%. And that would have created political problems as well as payment problems. But once you capped it, it meant that there was no immediate cost to government, either financial or political, and all the cost was borne by the economy, which is not as immediate. So now, when you uncap interest rates, if then banks have to start lending to the private sector, it means they are also going to start demanding a premium from the government. It's going to push the rates up for the government. If the borrowing cost of the governments go up by 1 percentage point, say like now they are borrowing by an average of 9, and it goes up to 10, if that is sort of works itself through the government debt cost, it increases government domestic interest payments by 30 billion shillings. So on the one hand, the economy wants flexible interest rates. But if that happens and it pushes up the government's cost of borrowing, that has implications for its fiscal sort of situation. So those are the things that now the government has to juggle. And of course, you could do that. And because you are now running into the political cycle and investor confidence is low, then you also don't get the supply response you're looking at from business. So that's the situation that we now find ourselves in. So how does it play out? Obviously, what you want, but if you're ever going to recover, whenever you recover, because you will, government will have to reduce its appetite for domestic borrowing so that it gets out of the domestic market and releases credit to the private sector, and also other things have to be done to create investor confidence. It can do that by cutting expenditure, or it can do that probably by finding cheaper foreign money. There are various ways it can do it. But if it has to do that, it has to deal with this, what I'm calling 5 things. And these are the things we've got to be watching. If you're watching the economy and policy over the next year or two, these are the things you're going to these are the things which are you can see government struggling with. One is what I've just described, what we call a fiscal monetary dilemma. So Treasury needs and wants a strong and stable shilling because of its debt service costs and low interest rates. But monetary policy effectiveness in the economy requires flexible interest and exchange rates. So if you make this, if for instance the government now, as it's trying to do, go to an IMF program to get an IMF standby facility, the IMF is going to insist on flexible interest and exchange rates. But if this trend upwards, that's gonna hit the fiscal whatever. So you're going to start seeing this tension playing out a lot more often, and it's actually playing out quite a bit. I did point out about the banking. So you now have this potential risk that you've got this fiscal spillovers. This go into a weak economy gives you high NPLs, and then you've got a bank profitability which is dependent on government securities. So if you try and unwind that situation, and for instance, one of the things which made the government do that draconian sort of confiscation of parastatal money is to pay pending bills. They're telling, why is the government insisting that suppliers must be paid? The reason why governments was so drastic is because its failure to pay suppliers is driving up the NPLs. And those NPLs are now beginning to cause instability in some banks. But it's a one-off. So you've confiscated these parastatal reserves. You've paid some suppliers, but the parastatals don't have money. So their current suppliers are going to become pending bills. So you haven't solved the problem. But so those are some of the, you took their reserves. You've just created new pending bills. You just shifted the pending bill problem from government and national government and county governments, if they have managed to pay, to the state corporations, which now had their working capital has been sort of confiscated. The other problem you're going to be struggling with is you got a debt overhang, because once you have high public debt, as we do now, investors see these high public debt as high future taxation. Because how is the debt going to be paid? It's going to be paid by taxing, isn't it? So if investors anticipate high future taxation, that's not the time to invest. You don't invest that by the time your project is maturing, government is just standing there. You know, you are in fact asking for tax breaks, but government is there. So it's an investment talent. But again, if government is doing fiscal consolidation, it is expecting a supply response in terms of private sector investment. So you got a chicken and egg. Government needs private investments to cut debt, but private investments wants to see less debt before. So how do you do that? You've got a coordination failure problem. The other problem we said is the political business cycle. As you're approaching the election and you're trying to do this, it's precisely because of our bad politics. That's when you get this cyclical sort of downturn. So you're trying to do this at precisely the wrong time. This is when now our bad politics really hurt you. Because when you own the private sector, on the one hand, you are saying private sector, you're trying to do this, but out there in the political field, all people are seeing is a slugfest, creating much more uncertainty. So that in itself is another thing which causes you problem. And finally, you've got the political calculus that if you're trying to do reform now, it's all pain and no gain for the incumbent. You've got an incumbent who's going to retire. If you start doing reform now, economic reforms are very painful. So what is there to gain for an incumbent? It's all pain and no gain. So you then have sort of, you're going to see, and you've already been seeing this, try and moving forward, and then they see this is going to be very politically painful, and then you see some pulling back. So that back and forth. So what these things do is that they add up to what you might call a lot of policy uncertainty, quite a lot of policy incoherence, which you are not understanding where it's coming from. People wonder why is government doing contradictory things. It's doing contradictory things because one day it's dealing with this, and the next day it's dealing with this. And then they realize, oops, this one is also a problem. So they try and do something to deal with that. What then can we expect? I think we can expect two things, basically. I think if you are the incumbent, your best strategy is to keep kicking the can. Yeah, your best strategy is to keep kicking the can and hope that you survive, that the thing doesn't unravel over the next 2 years. And you're going to see, I've seen some things which are being said now, instead of getting a grip of the problem. That's why you keep hearing, when you hear, government says we must do fiscal austerity, but we must protect resources of the big four. You must protect the big four. That is kicking the can. Yeah, because that's a contradiction in terms. Yeah, but you need to sort of put on a brave face and hope that this thing goes away. Scenario 2 is that something gives. Within that period, and all you need is you can have an economic trigger or a political trigger. Economic trigger is just a small shock. And you can have a small shock, and that shock then unravels, and then you find yourself having to respond to a sort of an economic crisis or a financial crisis of sorts. And that's a very distinct possibility in the next 2 years, that there may be some shock, because external shocks are there. You know, something happens out there in the Gulf, or as I say, in this sort of financial sort of unstable situation. If you sort of run into some of this emerging market turbulence and you have some capital flight, there is no shortage of the number of things that can that can cause you a trigger. The other one is that as the economic situation becomes more difficult, the population gets more restive. And then something, sort of maybe some policy, if you start doing austerity things, you end up with a kind of spontaneous thing that happened in Lebanon. You know, and you're trying to sort of enforce taxes, and the people just have enough and take to the streets. So those are the sort of distinct points. I don't think that they are very likely, given the current stage in the political cycle. You get a resolution of the situation. I think this sort of situation is mostly resolved. You get more resolution when you have a regime change. So thank you very much for listening to me.
I will ask you not to leave. I would like us to maybe just have maybe 3 or 4 questions or comments.
Thank you very much for that very enlightening presentation. My name is Ndii. I have a question for you. How does the bad politics, bad economy change in a scenario where you have a single term, whether it's 7 years or 5 years? Does that make it better?
I think the political configuration can change the political sort of incentive system. I don't think it changes the economic dynamics, because this is not peculiar to us. This economic delinquency happens in countries with all types of political system. So there's no political system which is immune from this sort of economic crisis. So if you're trying to reconfigure the political system, you're probably trying to reconfigure it for reasons of political stability and other factors. But all manner of economic mismanagement is very common. It is a very, very common phenomenon. If it wasn't, all countries would be rich. Yeah, all countries would be rich. It is the default is some level of economic mismanagement. It is only a few countries. In fact, if you look at when we're talking about countries, we are looking at as role models. There are just a few exceptions. If you look at the vast majority of the world countries, they are just in this morass. So I think if you haven't resolved the fundamental political contradictions in the society, if you don't confront what those political contradictions that produce dysfunctional politics, I think just trying to configure power one way or the other is not the solution. You really need to address the fundamentals.
My question is, as we sit here, we are the leaders. What can we do? What can be done? What is our role in this, and what do you see as a way out of this?
If I'm honest, I think the private sector needs a lot of introspection and ask itself what its role is in shaping not just the economic policy, which it has a lot of space. The private sector occupies a lot of policy space. You want to ask yourself, how have you used it? Yeah, and I think the answers are in that for the private sectors particularly, in there. For leaders in society, I think we need to start talking about a political alternative. So I'll be very blunt. We need to start talking about a political alternative. And we need to talk about political alternative because if you look at throughout, I was having this conversation not too long ago with one Thambo Becky, and looking around the region in Africa. And what you see is this is not what's going on. And what you see is that our post-colonial state and the leadership that is sort of enamored in it is really not being able to cope with the challenges of that we are facing as societies. Yeah? You see that very clearly, especially if you sit from where I sit with these people at fairly close quarters, and you realize how little time they actually have for the sort of issues that we are discussing here. Yeah. So I think we need to ask, so by political alternative, I mean not political alternative of individuals, but the kind of conversations we had in the early 90s about what is the political alternative to the system that got us there. I don't know what the answers are, but I think we have to ask what happened to those dialogues. Why did we stop dialoguing as a society, politically, on our political sort of future? There's a time that if you look at all the key institutions of society, other than the political class, have literally sort of lost their voice. And the church, the religious whatever were very strong. They sort of came down. Civil society was very strong. It sort of lost its voice. Private sector has issues. So I think that's what we got to revisit as a society and ask what happened. Because I don't think that there's a cut and dried solution. But I think we have to reconfigure our politics so that they are not just electoral competition. Politics is not, our politics has been reduced to electoral competition. Yeah? Yeah, it's a sort of sport every 5 years. The purpose that it serves, which is sort of society, sort of interest groups and all manner of people coming together to see how they sort of live and work together and solve problems. That's the thing that something has happened to it, and we need to find out what it is that made it go that route.
For those of us in the investment space, we thrive on hope. We have a longer term view. Maybe things could be so bad, the bad economics, the bad politics and all. In your view, do you think some of these things that we are seeing, call it the BBI, all sorts of things, are they likely to address some of these fundamental, call them, flaws in our political dispensations? Are we in this rat for the long term, or there is really some hope for us in the investment field? Just asking.
I wrote an article. I wrote a piece which made people very angry because I said Kenya is a cruel marriage, and people just got blind rage without reading carefully what I was saying. If you go to that article, I recounted. I said we have moments. We reach turning points. We have moments of opportunity, and we squander them. And I listed them. The handshake was another moment of opportunity that we have squandered. So I will add it to that list. I was there. I was in the room. I tried very hard to make those people understand that we cannot afford to squander this opportunity. One day I will explain how it is that we have squandered it, but we have. Because we personalized it, we allowed, again, we did not do, if you read what was written in that document and you are part of negotiating that document, and what this process has become, just compare the two. And you will see that something got lost in between. That's what we said, the process, if you read the document is very clear. It said that this is a leadership commitment of these two people, which I disagreed with, but I said if that's the way you want to do it, I think we should be institutional, but deal with institutions. But if you say you are taking responsibility, it's the first time I've had leaders saying they're taking responsibility. And they said it is going to be a political initiative outside of government. You read the document, it's very clear. It's the front page of the BBI report. Yeah? Then you ask yourself, how did it become a government report? And I was very clear in my mind. And I said, look, the opportunity for this was between March and August 2018. That's when, and we had enough time to do the fundamental things we needed to do, not to squander the crisis, because you want to use the crisis. But I'm afraid we have squandered that crisis. Now, as to where is hope, I said, I think the economy is going to force us to again come to a table somewhere. But I cannot guarantee success. But I think I am quite confident that before this economic crisis plays itself out, it's going to force us onto a political table. What we do there, I don't know.
Being a government-led economy instead of private sector-led economy, this particularly means that the austerity measures that the government is taking and currently are not actually going to benefit the economy, because this is going back to paying the debt, as we've clearly stated. And if you're a government sector economy, it means the government needs to spend for the money to circulate. Meaning that we are in this for, as you say, tightening the belt and so on and so forth. It's got to get tighter and tighter. So my question is, I might be a bit bleak on the political outlook, but in terms of the economic triggers, you said, so the only other thing that would change how things are moving is an economic trigger. So if you're a domestic investor or an international investor, what are some of these economic triggers would you be looking out for in terms of bringing back the investment back home?
I think it depends. I mean, if you are in the financial sort of services area where you are a new investment, then you are on the path of the hurricane, I'm afraid. Because you are in macro-financials really affect you. If you are in real investment in the economy, you can take a long-term view, because even you can say this turbulence will not, at most, it's 3-4 years. I think worst case scenario to my mind. I think it's more likely to be 3 on there. I mean, if we get to election and you have a change of regime, then because we are in the kind of situation we were between about 2000 and 2002. So obviously, if you get sort of regime change by virtue of election, it changes the politics. If you actually get a real change, then you're looking at whatever. So we're saying on the outside, if we do have an election which is not like a few we've had before, then you are looking at the next 2.5 years. But if you are in the financial space, I think I'm afraid you really are. But if you are doing power plants, like David, your gestation period is a couple of years anyway. So if you're looking to bring a power point on stream 3-4 years down the road, I don't think I would worry too much about. I would worry about the sort of long term. Somebody asked me the same question, like if you really wanted to sort of invest and look at whatever you insulated from this sort of thing, he asked me, what should I invest in? I don't plant trees. So yeah, I mean that's completely insulated from from your macro-financial and political stuff. So but I was making a point. If you are planting trees, you have a 5-6 year, 10-year horizon depending on what you're doing. So it's not completely saying that, but I'm saying if you are in consumer, and some of the people, my friends I've been talking to are in consumer, Tell them, I'm afraid, much as I try and sugarcoat this, if you are in fast-moving consumer goods, you have two problems. You're going to get the demand side, depressed demand, and then because you are a captive taxpayer, you're going to also get capricious taxation. So you... I'm afraid that is that's, so yeah, it varies from sector to sector, but certainly, but we've been here before. I think we've been here at least twice, 97 to 02, and certainly 90 to 93. So those of us who are a bit long in the tooth have know that we do. But also, I say they are costly. They have been actually quite costly. These sort of once you now converge political and economic shocks, it's actually quite costly. But hopefully, I think is that the economic will force the political issue as well, and force us to come to the table and ask what it is, which is what BBI should have done. But if you start saying how you sort of create 5 positions, that's not sort of including, that is not sort of national inclusiveness. I call that eat and let eat, Yeah. But that's that we can speak sort of bilateral.
Okay, guys, hand clap.